Sprint planning, proven practices. Sprint planning, like every Scrum event, works best when the participants are prepared and ready to go. Here's what my teams do to prepare for sprint planning. We have a definition of ready so that everyone knows what a user story needs to look like before we add it to the sprint backlog. Like our definition of done, I recommend defining your team's definition of ready before you start sprint 1 and refine it as necessary. I'll share an example with you in a moment. We run storytime workshops prior to sprint planning to elaborate our user stories. In Scrum, this is known as backlog refinement. During storytime workshops, the product owner and subject matter experts help the developers elaborate and refine the user stories until they meet our definition of ready. I recommend just-in-time requirements elaboration, which means that we elaborate the highest priority requirements just a sprint or two in advance of sprint planning. Don't refine all your requirements months in advance, because your effort is wasted if priorities change. On the other hand, don't wait until sprint planning to start refining stories either. The product owner is constantly ordering and reordering items in the product backlog, and I recommend that your product owner reviews the items near the top of the product backlog just before sprint planning, so that she doesn't need to do this work during the sprint planning event. This makes the best use of everyone's time during the workshop. Your product owner and developers should be drafting a sprint goal before sprint planning. The product owner should set an objective for the upcoming sprint and highlight which items might help meet that objective. These objectives are draft sprint goals that will be refined and agreed during sprint planning. I found that the definition of ready can sometimes be a useful tool for Scrum teams to have. It describes the characteristics that product backlog items, usually the user stories, must meet before the team will commit to them in a sprint backlog. But be careful of using the definition of ready. We're not writing a requirement specification that needs to be reviewed and approved before development starts. And it's not a set of strict rules that every product backlog item must meet before the developers will touch it. They're guidelines, that's all. Here's Team Superhero's definition of ready. To be included in a sprint, each user story should have a short, clear title, have a description that articulates the user role, the required functionality, and the business value, the who, the what, and the why. They're using Azure DevOps and have agreed that certain fields must be entered and labels applied so that stories can be easily found and filtered. Team Superhero has been caught waiting for other teams to complete dependent work, so now they prefer that there are no incomplete external dependencies on any of their stories. And each user story must have acceptance criteria and a design idea so that this story can be estimated. And the estimate needs to fall in the range of 1 to 8 points. Smaller stories are combined and larger stories are split so that they fall within this Goldilocks range. How your team plans its capacity for the upcoming sprint will vary a little depending upon the method you use to estimate your product backlog items. Here's the method that my teams use. First, we review our velocity over the past 5 sprints. You don't have to use 5 sprints, but don't go too far back. Somewhere between 3 and 7 feels about right. Here's the velocity for Team Superhero over the last 5 sprints. Velocity is just a measure of how much you get done in each sprint. Many Scrum teams use user stories to capture requirements and estimate their work in user story points. So velocity is how many story points got done in each sprint. From 22 points in sprint 12, it's trending up a little to 24 in sprint 16. Team Superhero forecasts a velocity of 24 points in sprint 17 as well. Next, we review the developer's recent availability. Here's our example. In sprint 16, the developers had 39 days capacity out of a possible total of 50, since they have 5 team members and they're running 2-week sprints. That's 10 days. Perhaps Batman and Robin were off fighting crime for half of the sprint. In the upcoming sprint, Sprint 17, the team expects to have 43 days of capacity, an increase of about 10%. The team delivered 27 points last sprint when there were 39 days available. Even though Batman and Robin were away, they got a couple of lucky breaks and achieved more than they expected. Based on this availability analysis, Team Superhero increases its forecast from 24 points to 26 points, predicting that they'll have 43 days capacity in Sprint 17. Lastly, the team forecasts its capacity to complete items from the product backlog. Here's the top of the product backlog. If we add the cumulative effort, then we can forecast that if our velocity is 24, then the team will be able to get the run the sales forecast story done. But the team is increasing its forecast a little higher because of its increased capacity. They're confident of getting the reassign opportunity story done in Sprint 17 too. The team draws the line at 8 stories and doesn't include the configure opportunity sales team story because 31 points just isn't a realistic forecast given their recent performance. And that's how we forecast our capacity. The Scrum Guide describes sprint planning in 3 parts. Here are the steps in my sprint planning workshops. I recommend agreeing the sprint goal first, before forecasting your capacity or anything else. Your team should already have a sprint objective drafted by the product owner prior to sprint planning. This is discussed and negotiated during sprint planning to become the sprint goal. The second part of sprint planning is to forecast the product backlog items we're going to get done in the sprint. We saw how to forecast capacity just a few moments ago. In the third part of sprint planning, the development team plans their work for the first few days of the sprint. If your team is decomposing items into tasks, then you'll spend some time completing the decomposition, at least for the items at the top of the backlog that you'll work on first. If you're not using tasks, then this part of sprint planning usually only takes a few moments as the team works out who is going to be working on each user story and reviewing the technical design concept the team discussed during elaboration. Here are some frequently asked questions about sprint planning in Microsoft Business Applications projects. When should we run sprint planning? Sprint planning needs to be completed before you start work on any items in the sprint. You can either conduct sprint planning late in the afternoon and start working on the items first thing the next day, or conduct sprint planning in the morning and then start work immediately afterwards. Like sprint reviews and sprint retrospectives, sprint planning is run every sprint. You can't run a sprint and you aren't practicing Scrum if you don't run sprint planning. Decomposing product backlog items into tasks used to be a practice described in earlier versions of the Scrum Guide, but now tasks barely even get a mention. So if using tasks is optional in Scrum, is it recommended for Microsoft Business Apps projects? Probably not. Studies have shown that the teams that decompose product backlog items into tasks are less productive on average than teams that don't. I guess the time it takes to write and track tasks isn't worth the effort. I used them on some of my early projects, but I haven't used tasks on any of my projects in the last few years, and my teams haven't missed them at all. You might want to use tasks on your first Scrum project, but just be wary of repetitive tasks like document the design, build the feature, perform functional testing, pass acceptance testing. There's not a lot of value in treating every story like a micro waterfall project. Some teams can get caught up in a vigorous debate about the forecast capacity. It's the Scrum Master's role to help facilitate this discussion and help the team come to a consensus in a reasonable time. One technique your team can use is to play the Fist of 5. It goes like this. In the Fist of 5, each team member holds up their hand at the same time. The number of fingers you're holding out corresponds to your level of support for the forecast. This game works best if you aren't a Lego minifigure and have actual fingers. Holding a fist showing no fingers means you want to block the current backlog. 1 finger means you're anxious, 2, you're concerned, 3, you're comfortable, 4, you're happy, and 5, you're ecstatic. We listen to the concerns of anyone holding out less than 3 fingers, adjust our sprint backlog, and play again until everyone is comfortable. Do we need a sprint goal for every sprint? The sprint goal is mentioned 19 times in the Scrum Guide, and more times than that in this course. It's important. If your team is struggling to set a sprint goal every sprint, try the method outlined next. Push your team to set great sprint goals, especially if it feels uncomfortable at first. What's the recommended technique for agreeing a good sprint goal? It's the product owner's responsibility to draft the sprint objective for each sprint. She can do this for each sprint in the release, during release planning, or during storytime workshops when requirements are being elaborated for upcoming sprints. Drafting a sprint objective during sprint planning is better than not having one, but it's better to do it before sprint planning. Do not try and agree a sprint goal while creating or after creating the sprint backlog. If you've got a sprint goal that sounds like complete the 4 candidate feedback stories, 3 stories on new hire orientation packs, 2 high priority bugs, and the spike to research online identity verification services, that's usually a sign that you had no draft sprint objective when you started sprint planning. That's not an example of a sprint goal, it's a summary of the sprint backlog. Don't select the product backlog items to include in your sprint backlog based on priority or business value alone. I know this sounds counterintuitive to a Scrum team committed to maximizing business value. Imagine the colors in the product backlog on the left and the sprint backlog on the right are different themes or epics. The colors could represent different departments, stakeholders or business processes, modules or epic features. In the sprint backlog, we've got 16 different colors representing an almost random collection of stories. There's no coherent objective here. There's nothing the team can focus on. A random collection of stories, even if they're all high value, reduces opportunities for collaboration because all the team members are going to be delivering unrelated work. It's going to be hard to get excited about tiny increments of progress on 16 different topics. Our stakeholders are not going to get excited enough to provide feedback when so much of the work doesn't relate to their domain. This is what happens when there's no draft objective before sprint planning and no coherent goal agreed during sprint planning. Instead, select a coherent set of related stories, like the blue stories in the sprint backlog here on the right. Some of the blue stories represent high-value work. Others might be lower priority. If delivered in this sprint, we'll have made significant progress towards the sprint objective drafted by the product owner. Most of the team are going to be working on blue stories in this sprint, so there'll be opportunities to work together. By delivering so many blue stories in one sprint, it helps us focus too, and reduces context switching when developers must jump between modules or components. The department or stakeholder represented by the blue stories is going to get excited about this sprint, and you can bet they'll be eager to inspect our work and provide feedback. How much of our sprint backlog should focus on the sprint goal? As much as possible. It's rare that you can focus 100% of your effort on stories that align to the sprint goal. At a minimum, half of your user stories should be a coherent set that supports the sprint goal. 64% of the stories are blue in the sprint backlog here, 36% relate to other epics or themes. Should we distribute or assign user stories to developers during sprint planning? Or should user stories remain unassigned so that developers can pick up work as soon as they have capacity during the sprint? If the stories are being distributed among the developers by the developers, then it doesn't matter whether stories are distributed or assigned during sprint planning or during the course of the sprint. Distributing stories during sprint planning can be helpful to check for capacity and skills. It's important though that the distribution isn't fixed, that it remains fluid and can change during the sprint. Remember too that we often get better results when more than one person works on each user story. Just so long as work is not being assigned to developers by the Scrum Master, the product owner, a senior developer, or heaven forbid, a project manager or any kind of manager outside the team.